Why does David Bentley Hart argue that science can't explain consciousness? Beginning to read his new book, All Things Are Full of Gods. It's actually really easy to read. In fact, I often find him not that enjoyable to read, but this book is. It's in the form of a Platonic dialogue between four characters. And in his first chapter, he begins to make his argument that essentially materialism can explain the fullness of our experience. Now, his big argument, at least in the first chapter, is that modern science, with its physicalist and materialist methodology, is logically unable to explain an inner personal experience or subjective experience. In a more developed or technical way, he argues something like, and I'm just reading my notes, I read this chapter this morning. He argues that quantitative third-person empirical evidence logically cannot name a causal relation between it, i.e. the quantitative third-person empirical evidence, materialism stuff, and qualitative first-person experience. Then second, by implication, physical events cannot produce mental events by purely physical causes. What he's kind of getting at, I know it's, kind of elevated language, but I think he is getting on something that's actually really, really important after reflection. And it works like this. Are you merely a machine, and all of your internal experiences, your thoughts, your reflections, your love, your desires, are they ultimately explainable by chemical reactions firing in your body? If they are, it's hard to escape a sort of determinism, a physical determinism, and it's hard to escape that. It's hard to justify a claim like George Grant does, for example, in his book English Speaking Justice, that we are fitted for justice. At least that's how he explains the traditional Western tradition. And we're fitted for justice in a way that is unexplainable by physical phenomena. But it's not just that there's a bad consequence, it's that David Bentley Hart argues, or is beginning to argue, I've only read the first chapter so far, that they're just different orders of operations. You can't say someone is short because they have charisma, for example. Those are just two different kinds of claims. So to say that you can quantify, calculate, add, compute an internal experience that is subjective in first person by third person, external, empirical, physicist, and materialistic, solely materialistic reasoning, it's just two different types of things. You can't, I can't look at your inner experience and get a measuring tape out and measure, the circumference of your skull and say, oh, now I know what your consciousness is like. Now I know what all of your loves, your desires, your feeling that you are you, your experience of looking at a beautiful rose. I can't measure that with a measuring tape. It's so different. And I don't have some sort of outside mechanism, outside tool to do that. There's no, even if I were to quantify all the chemical reactions happening in your brain and in your body at that moment, all I've done is counted chemical reactions. That's not a causal, full explanation of what's going on. Let me just read you a couple lines from David Bentley Hart's book. He says, simply said, a strictly quantitative method can't illuminate a strictly qualitative phenomenon like consciousness, and a strictly third-person method can't illuminate a strictly first-person experience. A little bit later he goes on, we're talking about merely apparent quantitative associations between totally, qualitatively dissimilar phenomena. There's just something completely different than counting, measuring, adding, calculating what is happening biologically in us, and that inner, subjective, first-person experience of consciousness. When I go to my garden outside and look at a raspberry bush and all the thousands of associations and the boundless experiences and the reflections and feelings, all of those things come into my mind. They are so unique to me that if you were to test my body, the best you could do is quantify that some biological reaction is happening. But you can't name whatever it is. You can't enter into my exact experience of being. David Bentley Hart says, no purely empirical explanation of the relation of physical to mental events will ever be found. It's a pretty big claim. We'll never devise any causal model adequate to explain the relation between the two, or even isolate any aspect of that relation as an object of scientific scrutiny. The problem has nothing to do with the limitations of our current scientific techniques or knowledge. It is entirely one of logic. No matter how sophisticated the cognitive sciences may become, mere quantitative advances in physical data will never be able to span the qualitative abyss between the objective and subjective dimensions of reality. So there's an abyss, something that you can't cross between objective, observable, measurable, quantitative science and the subjective experience of consciousness. He goes on to explain more of what he says. It's not that he doesn't give more reasons, although I should remind you, I've only read the first chapter. I'll probably be, if I find it interesting enough, I'll maybe talk about every chapter here. Here's a good way that he kind of sums up his argument near the end through the character of psyche. He says, I admit that we can't conclude just from the qualitative difference between objectivity and subjectivity that there aren't, as you say, any occult propensities in matter that might explain the reality of mental phenomena. I have other reasons for thinking it logically impossible that mental states are merely physical in nature. By the way, the word occult there just means hidden or unknown, just so you know that. My view, to be clear, is not that you can't in practice produce an account of how the third-person objective facts of electrochemistry are causally connected to mental events, though in fact you can't. Rather, it is also that it's logically impossible for physical events, understood mechanistically at least, to produce mental events by way of purely material causes. Well, he promises to reverse that order actually later and say that mind is more primary, I think, than the physical experience, or the physical, mechanical, chemical experiences that we have. Experience is the wrong word, but the functions. Now, I haven't got there yet, so I don't want to say too much about that. But I think it's safe to say that he has given a good opening salvo. I think he's beginning to make sense to me. Now, I know that maybe this sounds really technical, but if you just pause for a second and reflect with me, here's all that he's really trying to say. If I have a measuring tape, if I have a blood sample, if I have something connected to your brain that traces electrical signals, those will give me measurements. They'll give me numbers like, 90 beats per minute, or this chemical was released. That is a quantity that you've measured. That is a calculation, perhaps, that you've mixed together to see that there's some chemical result. But none of those things, by definition, tell you about the bliss of seeing the first rose bloom in the spring. It's just a different kind of thing. One is a quality of experience. One is a quantity of chemical reactions. One is the result of 1,000 experiences and interrelations and reasons and affections and desires, and we might say ultimately a connection to something that is some sort of order beyond space and time, to use the language of George Grant. And David Bentley Hart, in his opening chapter here, says it doesn't make sense that those things can be mutually, yes, they're connected, but the physicalist measurement doesn't explain the internal subjective experience. It's just not possible given what measuring quantitative tools can do. Well, that's all that I want to say for today. I will likely record more of these as I read through this book. I'm finding it so far helpful. As I said earlier, I often find David Bentley Hart not that fun to read. I find him verbose and over the top. But because he wrote this in a Platonic dialogue, I actually think this might be his format. I am really enjoying this book. It could be that I love I enjoy reading Platonic dialogues, and this is what this is. It is a work of Neoplatonic thought. I should note, if you're coming from, let's say, a dogmatic perspective, I wouldn't say I would read this book in order to affirm all of its conclusions. But in the first chapter so far, I mean, I would say there's nothing really objective that I would object to if you're a theist or if you believe in something beyond the physical realm. I think it's pretty straightforwardly a good traditional argument that you might see in George Grant or C.S. Lewis, for example. With that said, I will see you next time.